Senator Siewert.
Thank you, Mr President. I've been asked to speak on behalf of the Australian Greens and to offer our wholehearted, unreserved support for the apology the Prime Minister gave this morning. And I thank Christine in particular for letting me speak now. I also would like to say in advance, please forgive me if I stumble over a few words here. It's not very often that you can get up in this place and know that this place has done such a wonderful job collectively together. And to offer such a fulsome apology to those affected by the most appalling past practices and policies that affected so many mothers, fathers, children who have now grown into adults, grandparents, siblings. It takes, I think, a great deal of this place. It shows the best of this place, that we have been able to work together to support people so terribly affected by these practices. Just less than half an hour ago, I left the Great Hall where the apology was given. And I know many of you will have been in there sharing the emotion of that moment. And if you weren't, you missed something, because it has made a real difference to the people that were in that place. People who I've met, some of them many times before, others for the first time, who came up and said thank you. You could see such a difference in their faces, in their body language, that in terms of what this apology has meant. This apology has meant so much. For many, it is the start of their healing journey. And I will also now, and I'll go into it later, acknowledge the commitment the government's made for concrete measures, because recommendation 6 of the Senate Committee Inquiry said if you're going to make an apology, you've got to put concrete measures in as well, because apology is part of the journey, but concrete measures to help those that have been affected by these past policies and practices are so important. And the government has done that, and I thank them for that, because the sorts of measures they're putting in place will also help those affected by forced adoptions so much. When I tabled on behalf of the committee, and I want to also come back to the committee process in a minute, when I tabled the report, I quoted Charlotte Smith, and I met her this morning in the Great Hall. And I'd like to quote her again, because for me it sums up what we're talking about. And she said, "A mother whose child has been stolen does not only remember in her mind, she remembers with every fibre of her being." And the mothers and the fathers that I've met, you can tell that sums it up for them. Every fibre of your being. Imagine never having held your newborn baby, never seen it, in some instances never heard it cry. This is what these mothers and fathers, but in particular the mothers, have lived with for every day of their lives, and will continue to live it for every day of their lives. And some people, unfortunately, felt it so strongly that they're no longer with us. And the Prime Minister acknowledged those people today, and I would like to as well. These practices had permanent, ongoing impacts, and are still having those impacts on people's lives, and that has been acknowledged, and that's why we need these concrete measures. These practices happened, and that was what, for mothers and the fathers and the siblings and the grandparents, is firstly what they wanted acknowledged. First off, we didn't even acknowledge that, and now we have. We've acknowledged it and we've apologised for it, and that is very important, to have that acknowledgement. But it was the first step, was to actually acknowledge that these things happened, because all their lives they've been told. Some mothers actually they thought that it didn't happen, that they may have imagined it. Our Senator Committee heard the accounts, and remember I always use the words accounts of mothers. One mother told us of she actually thought that she may have imagined it. This horrible, horrible episode. And it wasn't until she went back to the hospital that it actually came back to her. Another mother had blocked it out, and it was only when she saw another program on TV and it all came back 20 years later. Fathers being left off birth certificates, wanting to acknowledge and take responsibility for their child, knowingly left off birth certificates, locked out of their children's lives. Mothers, as I said, never being able to hold their babies, being drugged, having their breasts bound, having curtains put up in front of them, pillows put over their faces, physically restrained from seeing their child, having their signatures forged on consent papers, being lied to about what consent papers were for, never being told that in fact they could actually change their minds, not being told what social security was available to them so that they could have in fact kept their child, being sent interstate with no support, being put into homes, forced to work for no wages, and being punished, made to kneel on the floor to scrub floors as a punishment, being put on beds in labour with no support whatsoever. You would think if you didn't know that perhaps I was making this up, perhaps people were making it up. But in fact, that's in fact what some mothers were told. That didn't happen. So that's why it's so important that this acknowledgement is being made. Because it did happen. These things did happen. Some of it wasn't technically illegal. It was unethical and immoral. And it did happen. Some of what happened was illegal. I'm absolutely convinced from the evidence that it was illegal. But overwhelmingly, we have now acknowledged what happened to the mothers and the fathers and the siblings. And I want to take a moment here to talk about both the adoptees and the siblings. Because adoptees have lived, as Senator Betts highlighted, have lived thinking, many of them, that their parents didn't want them, that they gave them away. They didn't. And that was another thing that mothers so strongly wanted their children to know, who are now adults, was that they didn't give them away. They did love them. Their children, their babies were loved. And I've had several mothers tell me that when they eventually, those that could trace their records, went to meet their child, in their minds they expected to see a baby. This baby was up to 50 years old. 50. For 50 years, imagine that, wanting to see your child. And up until recently, you couldn't get access to your records. They purposely couldn't get access to your records. And for mothers that were transferred interstate, made it even more difficult because you had to go through state and territory boundaries, and that makes it even more difficult. So for many adoptees, not all of them, I'm aware of that, but for many of these adoptees, they grew up thinking that their parents didn't want them and gave them away. And that's not a good foundation for life, even when your adoptive family is very supportive. And you'll be aware that in the Senate report we had many accounts, unfortunately, of where adoptees or children were put in families where they didn't have a good home life, that they were abused. And that adds to the pain of the mothers and fathers of those children, now adults. But this plays out then to their siblings. And one person said to me, during and after the it was during the inquiry, said, "Hearing the evidence now, I understand why my mother was so protective of myself and my siblings, because my mother had had a child taken and it was never going to happen to her again." And it helped explain to them why their mother was so protective. Had an impact on grandparents, who were also lied to, misled, many, not all, many also. And I vividly remember the evidence we received in my home state of Western Australia. And while I'm there, this is from the mothers in Western Australia. I promised I would wear it in the chamber. Of a young woman, and this was actually in the early 80s. So this just wasn't confined to the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It happened in the 80s as well. That she was a young woman, very young woman. Her partner wanted to stand by her. She didn't want to adopt out the baby, and her parents wanted to help look after the baby. Her parents were threatened with the police when they went to the nursery. Her parents were threatened with the police if they didn't leave the premises. And that child was adopted out. And to make matters worse, this young woman didn't find out that in fact her parents had been to the hospital and tried to support her and to try and assure the authorities that they would help look after the baby. And they thought that the young woman had agreed to have the baby adopted out. And it wasn't till years later that they both, because it was something that you didn't talk about, it wasn't till years later that the mother and the parents found out what had gone on. These parents were tricked, coerced, drugged, people signing consent forms in a drug state, people's obviously false signatures because the name was spelt wrong in a signature on a consent form. All these things happened. This is, I'm not supposed to bring props in, but I'm sorry, Mr. President, I did. This is the apology from the Prime Minister, and every person that was in the Great Hall today got one of these. And for those mothers, fathers, siblings, adoptees, mothers, fathers, adoptees, the siblings and the grandparents, this will be one of the most important pieces of paper in their lives. It is as I said earlier, it's doesn't happen that often in this place when we can all, as one, offer this sort of apology and work together the way we have to ensure that this apology came about. And I'd like to particularly thank the committee members of the Senate Committee, Community Affairs Senate Committee References Group, and it's nearly the same for the legislation group, so I'll say the Community Affairs Committee. More often than not, we issue consensus reports. And it's a pleasure to work with people across the chamber on that committee, because we usually get the pretty tough questions, and this one was the toughest committee inquiry that we've done. There was never a dry eye in any of the inquiries for this, any of the hearings for this inquiry. We always had to have boxes of tissues there for both ourselves and the witnesses and the members of the audience, because there's some people that came along, some mothers and fathers and adoptees that came along just to hear the evidence. That committee inquiry, where people and I think I've said this before, people in many cases for the first time gave their accounts of what had happened. For the first time they had spoken publicly about what had happened to them. And when you think about it, for some of the women in particular that shared their stories, they were 50, 60, some a bit older. For that long in their life, for 50 years, they'd held on to their account. in some instances only very recently telling their families. So for those people, those women and men that came along to share their accounts, I really want to acknowledge and encourage everybody to acknowledge the bravery of their being able to share their accounts, because it made such a difference for us to be able to hear the evidence that they gave the Senate inquiry. And it makes me feel very proud and honoured to have been able to work on the committee and on this issue. And many people came up today and said, thank you, you did this and you did that. Well, no, the committee inquiry presented on their behalf the evidence. People have been working on this issue for decades, and it's the culmination of their work that has achieved this apology. And I want to acknowledge their hard work for years, and it's only recently that this has become fairly public. They've fought for years to get this on the agenda, and it's on the agenda. We have the government's response, and I'm going to read each response to each particular recommendation, the 20 recommendations. I know the government's gone a long way in the concrete recommendations, and that's really good. Our job now is to make sure that gets delivered, make sure the recommendations are implemented, because this apology is part of the step on the healing journey. It's been my privilege to be able to walk some way of this journey with those affected by these horrible past policies and practices, and also to share that journey with members of this place who have worked so hard. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge Senator Moore, Senator Brown, Senator Boyce, Senator McKenzie, who all heard, and Senator Adams, who also participated in the inquiry, who all shared this journey as well. So I reiterate, on behalf of the Greens, I offer our profound, wholehearted support for this apology. Thank you.
Senator Moore.
Today the Senate and the Parliament as a whole have done their job, and we've heard that from previous speakers in this place. In terms of what's occurred in this area, we have had a group of Australian citizens who were wronged, and what happened was they came to their parliamentarians, their state parliamentarians, their federal parliamentarians, and said that something had gone wrong, they had been hurt, and someone should do something about it. This struggle has been going on since the 1960s, when the women first started saying that what had happened was incorrect. What had happened in that period up until when we first got this reference in 2011 was that there had been a series of state inquiries as far back as 1999 in Tasmania, also in Victoria, also in New South Wales. And the sad thing, amongst so many sad things, is that each of those inquiries reported back, identified the wrongs, showed that these issues were in place, made lots of sad stories, and nothing happened. That is the true sadness of what's happened since 1999. But in this case, when finally women from across this country, and every state had women who spoke out in that period, every single state and territory had women who had been carrying their hurt for years, who actually moved forward and never gave up, Mr. President, never gave up, and came to their Senate and said there should be an inquiry. And after a lot of discussion, because I have to admit the first time the request came it wasn't an immediate response, which is sometimes what occurs, but through ongoing effort, through ongoing discussion, there was an agreement in this place from every group in this place that there should be a Senate inquiry into the area. And then the process began. We travelled the country, we talked with women, we listened to women, we listened to young people who identified that they had been adopted and hadn't met their parents. And I'm not going to go back through all the accounts that Senator Siewert has mentioned. The important thing is that people should read the inquiry. They should read the report, which is not that large, and they should not have people telling them what was said. They should read it themselves, and they should hear from the people who had the courage, the commitment and the anger to come forward and tell us what was wrong and what should be done about it. And they were not backward in coming forward, Mr President. In fact, they gave us chapter and verse about for how long they had been speaking about these issues and how their anger and betrayal was made worse because no action had been taken previously. It was though we were the court of last resort when they came to see us. And no one could be unaffected by what we heard. But there was more than that. They wanted action taken. And in fact, after many months of inquiry, and I also want to commend all the senators who took part in this event, where sometimes it actually comes down that the committee itself, it's just given as a matter of course that senators do their job as we do, and we come up with reports, some of which are read, some of which aren't, some recommendations picked up, some not. However, in this case, as in many in community affairs, there was more than just coming and listening and putting a report together. There was a personal connection. There was a personal commitment that we had work to do and that it was important that it happened. So naturally to Senator Siewert, who chaired through the whole process, to Senator Judith Adams, who actually attended 2 of these inquiries and at one stage really should not have been there, Mr President, but was determined to be there. To Senator Sue Boyce, who again, Sue is unable to be with us today because she's unwell, and she's emailed all of us to say she wants to be here. And I can guarantee that at many times in the future we'll hear from Senator Boyce on this issue. Senator Carol Brown, Senator Bridget McKenzie, who's going to speak in this discussion, Senator Helen Coonan, who attended one committee hearing in Sydney and also read many of the submissions, and also Senator Katrina Billick, who came to a couple of the committee hearings, particularly in her home state of Tasmania. So for that group of senators, we were able to work with our amazing Secretariat, who, as Senator Siewert had pointed out, there were lots of tissues, there was lots of emotion at all these hearings because there had to be, because we were sharing. It wasn't a matter, of course, of someone giving evidence and people on the other side of the table listening to that evidence and people recording then to go away into the ether. This was a discussion of people who cared. But I want to particularly acknowledge the Secretariat because sometimes it's forgotten that the emotion, the passion, the strain is actually shared fully by the Secretariat members, all of them. The Secretary of the committee is Ian Holland, but for all the members of that team. Because what happens in these inquiries is that people who are wanting to talk with us find a need to consistently ring up and email and find someone on the other end of the phone with whom they can talk and just make sure that things are happening and things are being done correctly. Now, oftentimes that's not the senators. Oftentimes that's the Secretariat members who are the ones that can tell you whether a woman from Victoria who was promised that she would have extra time to put her submission in but was unwell and too scared to come, whether she would actually have a chance to talk with us at another